We are studying the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence in Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga, where he describes the planes on which we can experience the world, the realm of the whole cosmos, and what makes for each plane to have its distinctive characteristics. And as I have mentioned before, there is no text existent which actually answers this question of what makes a plane specific to its qualities. But once you have understood that, we understand not only the different planes which are possible, but also how they relate to each other and how therefore one can enter across in relation across planes or even experience all of them. This entire knowledge is now open before us once the basic principles are recognized and understood. And even in the text, Sri Aurobindo points out that he had hoped to deal with a much more detailed exposition of this occult knowledge, but for a lack of time, he did not have occasion to do it. And yet in this chapter, the basic foundations and principles of what could be developed into a whole treatise on the occult knowledge have been laid here. And so this chapter is fascinating, and since this is our objective to go in detail, I've mentioned how we will be exploring some of the implications of these principles in the direction of the occult knowledge and even in occult practices as they are characterized in various systems around the world. Of course, to the extent that it relates to the foundation of the spiritual knowledge, which is the focus of Sri Aurobindo's text. In the earlier portions of the chapter, Sri Aurobindo has described what is meant by a plane of consciousness or a plane of existence, and he describes it as a general settled poise or world of relations between Purusha and Prakriti, between the soul and nature. Anything that is existing has within it two poises. There is the poise which looks upon all that is being revealed or drawn out in the experience, and the poise that stands back observing, or the basis of that poise which holds all potentiality, is what we call Purusha or soul. And then all of its potentialities and powers and capacities that it draws out and expresses, those powers and potentialities we call nature or Prakriti. And the relationship between these two is what defines the world. Now, as some examples which we had touched several weeks ago, but which would help us to bring clarity in what this means. One example would be a person who is blind. The consciousness which is aware is there centered, but what is it becoming aware of? The powers that are drawn out primarily are of sensations, smells, tastes, sounds, but the power of sight has not been drawn out. It is there, implicit. Even a blind person creates an image of the world around him. So the power to see is there, but it is as if involved or indrawn or made only partially explicit, not drawn out fully. For the full drawing out, it is dependent on the physical machinery of the body, and if for some reason this machinery is defective, then there is only a partial drawing out. And so the relationship between soul and the powers drawn out in nature have been restricted, and therefore the person experiences the world as, dark. If other powers also had been similarly less drawn out, you will find your experience of the world to that extent limited, narrowed, dulled, compared to what we call normal human range. On the other hand, if in the normal human consciousness we recognize that we have still many more powers, or the powers drawn out are still only partially drawn out, and we draw them out even more intensely, more completely, then we will experience the world much more rich, much more in depth, much more detailed. And even, as we described, there is a kind of a sixth sense which can further fill in, which opens even more. This relationship of the consciousness and its powers and the potentialities drawn out between soul and nature is what defines your band of experience and the character of the world. The same person in dream state, once separated from the physical body, living in a consciousness which is largely of the vital body, has a different relationship with his nature, with the powers drawn out, and experiences his world in the vital domain, much less or almost none in the physical domain, and so on. Somebody daydreaming lives or is identified at that moment almost entirely with the mind. The body is quiescent, the emotions are quiescent, he is living in his thoughts and in the mind's picturing or experiencing, relating to his thoughts, to his sense of past, present, future events, or in some idealistic dream world. That is the domain in which he is presently living. That is the world, therefore, in which he is currently focused or identified with. And so what we realize is the individual soul has the possibility of experiencing many different gradations of consciousness or many different worlds, able to narrow and modulate how much one engages. But all this is taking place in the larger cosmos, where there is the cosmic Purusha and cosmic nature, and the relationships there are much more rich and complete. All possible domains are being experienced by the cosmic Purusha, of which we individual Purushas identify with a small part. And so, in the portion we have just completed reading, Sri Aurobindo says, here, the soul lives in a material universe. Of that alone, it is immediately conscious. The realization of its potentialities in that is the problem with which it is concerned. And the soul is only concerned with what powers can I draw out in this material domain. All other worlds are as if shut out or only seen through the filter of this primary relationship of matter. And since there are all those potentialities, all those ranges of relationships still waiting, they are as if either hidden or involved in matter. They begin to creep out. And as they emerge, we have the sense of discovery or even evolution. And so the physical world, because it is fixed in form and bound to rigidity of form, is the domain where everything else is as if hidden and therefore able to evolve. If you go to other domains, there is no rigidity of form. Whatever their characteristics, they more freely flow, and you do not have the same experience of evolution there. We have also seen the same rigidity of matter binds and limits and constrains the very sense of purpose that the soul has in matter. Sri Aurobindo pointed out earlier that finally the relationship of the world or the experience of the world is dependent on how nature relates to the three things, the three characteristics of the soul: its existence, its conscious energy, and its experience of delight. The way nature sets up relations with these three things defines the character of the world. And in the physical world, it is its existence which is given the sense of material form. The energy is as if contained inside matter, as if hidden inside form, and the sense of delight is almost completely obliterated or hidden so deeply that only a little bit of its spurts of delight can barely come out. And this makes for the experience of the physical world where everything is as if bound. And the whole point of it, therefore, if it is bound, is for it to emerge. And so the purpose of life in the physical world is this liberation or coming into self-knowledge and self-delight. And this has to be the highest goal of life in the material world. Except that everything in the material world resists, opposes, delays, weakens these possibilities. So it's a world of adventure. But Sri Aurobindo points out that this need not be the only relation. There can be other relations of Purusha with Prakriti. And so he moves to the description of the next level or plane of consciousness, which is the vital world. But before that, a very important point which was made earlier, which we saw, that the fact that we are constrained makes for the dissatisfaction of humanity. And if the material universe was the only thing existing, then there would be no hope, because matter is so rigid and limiting. What is it that gives in us the hope of fulfilling, of growing, to become more? And he points to 4 things. There must be either worlds in which he is liberated from these incomplete, unsatisfactory relations of Purusha with Prakriti, or planes of his own being by ascending which he can transcend them, or worlds, beings, planes higher from which he can receive or be helped to knowledge, powers and joys. One of these should always be available. If these were not, there would be no hope. And then he says all these things, the ancient knowledge asserts, exist. Other worlds which are outside in the cosmos, higher planes within us, the possibility of communication, of ascension, of growth by contact with and influence from that which is above him in the present scale of his realized being. These 3 things are necessary if there is to be any growth, and you will see all growth in the physical life finally boils down to something of these 3. If you remove these 3, then we live, or we continue to live, as merely thinking animals. Bring in these 3 and there is immediately the growth that begins. Of the 3, the third is the influence that comes from higher planes, other worlds, or even higher beings. And through that influence, through that contact, we experience some growth. And this is extremely important in human history. Without any conscious effort of humanity, through these influences, things come into the collective life of humanity. Those influences coming lift humanity, sometimes as a whole, sometimes in a group, sometimes an individual. They lift momentarily, open to some higher possibilities, or work through that contact and influence to manifest those higher possibilities. All the great things that human beings have ever done in history have been because of such an influence. And this influence can happen even if we are not conscious of its source or even of the influence. Suddenly a person is seized with an idea, with an inspiration, and does something extraordinary, and that's it. All the rest of his life he may be a completely normal person, but at that moment, in the point of contact of that influence, something extraordinary is done. But this is just a general factor. Always the secret source of all the great things of humanity, it is also the secret source of some of the most horrible things. Because equally the influence could be dark and could bring something negative. But the other two, the possibility of other worlds and higher planes, are not directly within the realm of the human experience, The fact of higher planes we may briefly glimpse, and when we begin to make an effort to access them, then we begin the proper process of yoga. If we do not make that conscious effort, there is no conscious yoga. At best, there is an unconscious yoga of nature. The influences that come from above may awaken us to that possibility, and then we may begin to make an effort. But this already requires something of our personal effort in order to be able to grow. The fact of higher worlds, other worlds, is even more distant because we cannot experience them directly. At best, we may say we experience them in states of dream, at night, while sleeping. Occasionally, as part of the yogic process, if we seek to ascend in consciousness, we may have glimpses of those domains, but that's about all. These are the three things by which the human evolution is driven forward. Now, having set this as the background, Sri Aurobindo smoothly moves now to what are these higher worlds like? And he takes the immediate next world. If the physical world is world of form, where existence is as if bound and dependent on matter, the vital world we discover is so different. Here, the energy, the drive, the power aspect of consciousness is the primary thing. And we read the first sentence last time, but we will now go into more detail. As there is a poise of the relations of Purusha and Prakriti, in which matter is the first determinant, a world of material existence, so there is another world, just above it, in which matter is not supreme, but rather life force takes its place as the first determinant. Now, the important thing is matter is not supreme, but it may still be there. And so the suggestion is quite fascinating. Each of these worlds not only has its own free domain, but it kind of weaves into the material world, or something of the material world extends in substantiality into these domains also. They blend into each other, something which he will then describe in detail later. In this world, forms do not determine the conditions of the life, but it is life which determines the form. And therefore, forms are there much more fluid, free. So we are so used to the physical world, we assume this is how everything will be. That there is a form, and the form has a quality. And the quality is dependent on the form. So if the plant does not have certain genes, then it will not be able to grow to be tall. If you can introduce those genes, then you can make the plant taller, stronger, more resilient, or change color, and so on. All properties of things boil down to their form. So the color of this flower, the red tint, comes from the fact that there is a particular structure of molecules, and light hitting it is absorbed because of that form of molecules and allowing only red to reflect. All other colors, all other frequencies are as if absorbed. At least that's the logic of the color. So the color depends on the form. If you play with the molecules, the color will change. In the vital world, it's reversed. Rather, the quality of color, the quality of red is first. Because it has quality of red, the form takes on a certain pattern. And that pattern is fluid. It can, color red can express in many different ways. So look at a more distinct example. A human being is strong, can lift a heavy weight when his muscles are strong and large and thick. So you look at the body and you can say, this person is strong. But when the person tries to lift, he says, I can't lift more than 5 kilos because I have an illness of the nerves which prevents me. It gives me pain when I try to lift. But I couldn't see it because your form was so strong looking. In the vital world, the thing reverses. You have the strength. It doesn't matter what your form is. In fact, the form expresses the strength. So when I express my strength, my form may take a certain shape, which may have a bloated muscle bulging. But when I choose not to express the strength, then the muscles may simply flatten down. The form is actually dynamic, it swells up. Or I may choose to express strength without the bloatedness. And so my form takes a quality of great strength, but the shape doesn't change. So I look thin, supple, maybe perhaps there is a sense of fragility and subtlety in the shape, but you can feel the energy which is strong. You've seen human beings like that also. They look deceptively fragile, but when they act, you have this unusual strength physically. But if you look from a distance, the body shape does not tell you what strength they have. But if you become very quiet and feel their energy, you can feel, this person has a great force of vitality. In the vital world, it will be the reverse. You will first feel the hit of the vital force. Wow, this is a strong form, being. And then the form may be bloated muscle or not, does not matter, because it is fluid. So, in this world, form does not determine the conditions of the life, but it is life which determines the form, and therefore forms are there much more free, fluid. They can change. A good example of what it feels like, or how we would represent it visually in form, is what you see in cartoons. Now you will see, again, go back to the example of Tom and Jerry as a cartoon. So, let's say it's a mouse and a cat. That's the game. I'm taking this example because most of you would have seen it at some time or other. So when the cat is reaching out to catch the mouse, you'll see the movement of the arm stretches out. The arm literally stretches out and grabs and pulls. This gigantic, dramatic movement of pulling. Characteristic of the vital energy, which is expressed in the movement of the form. You see, physically, because you're showing in a cartoon, you can stretch things, but physically it would not have been possible. But the movement of the vital energy is captured in this movement. And you feel immediately this largeness of the vital. And then when the same cat is now afraid, it becomes small, it shrinks, it becomes flat, loses color. The same one becomes happy, bright, fresh color, bubbling energy. Size grows, expands. Physically also, some animals express this in gesture. When they're afraid, they shrink to a small size. When they are angry, they bloat out. But it's an attempt in form to match the shift of energy of the vital energy or the vital body. If you think about it in this way and begin to observe all the forms in the physical world, you will notice that finally the physical form is as if blocking, preventing the free expression of the vital. But the vital is pushing against the form and trying somehow to stretch it. You see a human being who is depressed, shrinks down, looks down, slumps, all the muscles go like that. Literally the physical size seems to shrink. The same person when he is happy and excited, blooming, you can feel the energy bursting out, widening. But the energy body is able to do that. The physical body only follows as much as it can. Now think of the implications of this. If the energy body is pushing against the physical body, and the push remains consistent, not for a few minutes, not for a few hours, but for days, weeks, months, years, what will happen to the physical body? It will tend to shape itself to match the physical tendency. So there's an example Mother gives of somebody in Japan that she met who believed that all strength comes from the belly, because that's the physical center of life force in the body. And so the man believed that anybody who has great vitality and strength will have a large belly. And Mother jokes that she pointed at that time, it was Rabindranath Tagore had also come there. And mother pointed to him and said, he doesn't have a large belly. And the man said, oh yeah, watch out, in a few years he will have a large belly. But the idea behind it was that eventually the body form tends to express the vital body's character. So if the vital is large and is expansive, the body will tend to also become large and expansive. Or a part of the body in which the vital is expanding will tend to swell up and grow large also. Or a part of the body where the vital energy is shrinking from fear, insecurity, or some other incapacity, that part of the physical also will tend to shrivel and grow small. And if you persist for a few months or years, it can create a disbalance of the physical working. Certain organs become now ineffective, incapable, and you have illnesses. Or in the exaggerated expansion, the organs become bloated or inflamed, and you have an illness. If you think about the relationship, the logic of it is impeccable. Every physical illness can be traced back to a pattern of life force in the vital body, which is represented in the very nature of the illness. You see, in some people, there is a sickness, let's say there is a cancer, which very neatly takes the form of a tumor, neatly sealed. You can cut it out and the cancer is gone. In other people, the same thing spreads. What's the difference? And for the same type of cancer, you can have a cancer which is neatly bound and cancer which is spreading. Where the energy is able to contain whatever the cause of the cancer, the trigger of it, and bind it and limit it, hold it, it's taken care of. Where the energy is disturbed, agitated, unable to contain and hold, it tends to spread. If you notice, for example, a person who is frequently sick, or let's take the experience of fear. Where do you experience the fear? When the point where it hits you is in the belly. The stomach is as if pulled in, the energy is pulled in, and the rest of the body only follows, or the fear as it spreads has its center here in the stomach. Now the moment you have a fear sensation, everything is constricted there, all the muscles tighten, all the vessels which were otherwise putting out fluids also dry up and tighten. For a few minutes, it can last maybe a few hours. But if every day you enter a workspace where your relationship with the environment is of insecurity and fear, there's a slight tightening of that muscle, of the energy actually, which is followed and represented by the muscle tightening for a few days, for a few weeks, for a few months, and eventually you realize that it is remaining tight always. And obviously you will have an illness of the abdomen. Where specifically, what form of it? You can even say it will be a form where something is constricted, shrinking, not flowing freely. You can even describe the character of the illness, but the exact location may vary because there will be other factors also involved. Every illness can be traced back to an energy pattern which is out of sync, which can be traced back to an emotional pattern in the vital body. So the physical body, we can even see, is almost like a concretization of the movement of energy in the vital body. If you can correct for things in the vital body, eventually it will settle in the physical. Eventually, there's a time lapse involved always. If there is a distortion in the vital, eventually it settles in the gross physical and becomes permanent in the body shape, because that's the nature of matter. You correct it now internally, this may still continue and take a while before it ripples out all the way. But if you can impose the vital energy into the body, you can speed up that whole process and make it change rapidly. How rapidly? Now this is an example perhaps I've given before, but it is one of the most dramatic examples of all examples. There are people who have what we call multiple personalities. Actually, they represent some form of possession, where some vital being takes over the personality, takes on the body basically as a shell, as a container, and expresses itself. It is thrown out, something else replaces. Multiple personalities is basically that. What is interesting to see in certain kinds of multiple personality which are quite extreme, the physiology also changes to reflect the being that comes in. In its most obvious form, the voice changes. Sometimes the color of the eyes changes. Just like that, from a moment to the next, as the personality flips, the eyes color change, the voice patterns change, mannerisms change. So we can still say, all right, this can be modified because I can personally imitate a different voice. So it's not a physiological change. But then we go deeper, there are examples in which an illness also changes. So one of the personalities is diabetic, and when that personality is active, there is a typical response in the biology of a diabetic response to the sugar. It flips to the other personality and he can eat all the sugar he wants. He is not diabetic, he has no problem. One personality is myopic, the other personality has completely normal sight. And you cannot explain this in terms of pure physiological change. How in an instant an entire illness pattern can be swapped in or swapped out. And then going further, during such unusual states where a personality enters the physical body and grips it sufficiently, it can even bring in certain elements of the vital body's immunity into the physical. And during that state, the person, for example, could be immune to fire. He can stick his hand in the fire and not be burnt. Or he can be hit with a sharp sword and not be injured. And various other phenomena. The body temperatures could be changed. Many things can happen which are entirely impossible in the normal physical range of life working. But when some other kind of life energy plugs in and warps it, it is able to change in an instant. This is the interesting thing. The entire pattern of the biology. What this implies for us is something so extraordinary that scientists don't want to explore this. What it implies is that actually almost every one of your illnesses can be simply swapped out by a change of consciousness, just like that. When that happens, we call it a miracle. It can happen by you becoming conscious in your vital body and changing completely the pattern of energy. Of course, it requires a certain mastery. Or it can happen from outside, a divine influence entering and changing it, liberating a knot, dissolving a knot, or imprinting a completely different pattern of energy, and in the physical body, the change takes place either instantly or very rapidly. And that's when you have a miraculous cure. Sometimes within a few minutes, sometimes within a few hours, but what would otherwise have taken months of change happens so quickly. And all of these are documented events, except they didn't understand. There is no rationale to explain them. But once we understand the relationship of the vital body with the mental body, with the physical body, then these things become almost obvious. But this we can understand when we know what the vital body actually is in itself, and it's what it is capable of. And so then we enter this exploration now, not only of the character of the vital body and consciousness in us individually, but the whole realm of the vital world, which is made of this grade of consciousness, of this relationship of Purusha and Prakriti. So here you see, unlike in matter, where everything is bound in matter and as if dependent on matter, here everything is expressive of life force, particularly that aspect which is force of consciousness, which is what life force represents really. So therefore, forms are there much more free, fluid, largely, and to our conceptions, strangely variable. First of all, they are largely variable. What that means is there can be huge shifts. The flower could suddenly become big or could become small, but strangely variable. And that's where this whole idea of The experiences we have in dreams takes place, where we will read from an example mother narrates, the tiger becomes the cat. How did that happen? It's not possible physically. So we say, it's just a dream, it is unreal. Or it's a hallucination because the form changed, just like that. Or it's a hallucination, not real. No, that's not true. It is not possible or real to the physical domain, but it is the normal character of the vital domain. So everywhere where you see forms changing, forms fluid, you know that you belong, or you're looking at something which belongs to the vital plane. In fact, all of the cartoons you will see for children are representations in physical form of realities of the vital plane. Of course, a very limited representation. And it's one of the reasons why one does not wish the cartoons to be really of very educational value. At best, they expose the child to the vital realm, not to the deeper psychic or spiritual possibilities. But, well, because it gives you a world where you're more free, more fluid, it's like a freeing up from the physical world and entering into something at least a little more large. So, to our conception, strangely variable than in the material world. Why to our conception? Because when you're in the vital plane, this is completely normal. The shifts that take place of form are completely normal. This life force is not inconscient material force, which was the character of the physical world. Not even, except in its lowest movements, an elemental subconscient energy, but a conscious force. So the physical domain was primarily of inconscient material force and even an elemental subconscious energy, but here it is conscious force of being which makes for formation. But much more essentially, it's not even an elemental subconscious force, but a conscious force of being which makes for formation, but much more essentially for enjoyment, possession, satisfaction of its own dynamic impulse. So conscious force trying to express form, but no, form is not so important. What is more important to the force is its own enjoyment, possessing itself, satisfying itself. And what particularly of itself? The impulse, the impulsiveness of the energy. I find satisfaction in flowing in the impulse and enjoying the impulse and possessing the impulse and just being satisfied with the impulses. Now look at so much of human life today, especially when we have emerged out of struggles and have attained to some level of comfort in what we call modern life. The moment we come to some level of comfort, what do people want to do? When they're struggling to survive, well, they want to now survive and become more comfortable. But once they've come into comfort, you have enough money to spend to pretty much do whatever you want. What do you start doing? You'll find it goes back to this. You want to enjoy, you want to find satisfaction, and you want to just be happy in the enjoyment and in the satisfaction. That's it. And that is vital life. A large part of humanity is living in the vital life only. There is not even an attempt to rise to mental values. What is good? What is better? Is there an ideal? Can I grow more perfect? Can I make it better somehow, which goes beyond just my personal enjoyment? That belongs to the domain of mind. They do not even reach there. If you see the way people live, go into any comfortable society in the world, and it's all over the world, patches of comfort and discomfort everywhere in the inequality. But go into the comfortable realm where the wealthy people live, let's say, with wealthy facilities, and watch them from the point they wake up till they go to sleep. You will find at every moment the primary drive is the enjoyment, possession of enjoyment of the impulse and satisfaction of the impulse of whatever impulse comes out from them at that moment. And if you question where this impulse came from, it's disorienting. Why do you want to do this? I want to. This is what is important. You say, but why don't you do something which is better? It doesn't interest me. This is what gives me satisfaction, and I stop with my personal satisfaction. And this is so deeply rooted, it's how animals live. The difference is that as human beings, we have the power of thought subjugated to this impulse. And so we live like animals with the power of thought which serves this impulse only, not serving a higher ideal. So this is the bulk of humanity, but this is also the nature of the vital. Desire and satisfaction of impulse are therefore the first law of this world of sheer vital existence. Now he will characterize the vital world in itself, sheer, but the same vital also leans into the physical, leans into the mental, has a turn to the psychic and even a turn to the spiritual. But to know the vital, you must first see what it is in itself when it is free of all those other influences. Desire and satisfaction of impulse. Whenever an impulse rises, you need to satisfy it. To hold it back is not normal for the vital. To have a desire and to live by desire and to live only by desire is characteristic of the vital. Now what happens when you go out of the physical body and enter the vital world? What are you? You are this bundle of desire and satisfaction of desire. And that's where the problem comes. Whatever desires you have now immediately become urges to fulfill, to justify, and to experience. Automatically, instantly, because you are made of this desire bundle of energy. Whatever fears you have also become activated freely. Whatever hopes, desires, or whatever mental hopes you may have in your desires also tend to shape the forms and circumstances. So notice what happens in dream state. You are, let's say, in a forest. Suddenly the fear rises. Are they dangerous animals? But you see, the thought comes later. The fear rises, which becomes the thought. And you turn, where is the dangerous animal? And of course, then you see the dangerous animal, because now it has taken the form. Your fear has represented itself in the form of that dangerous animal. It's looking at me, but it's far away. What if it comes close and immediately it starts coming close? Or immediately, instantly, it is close. In the dream state, it's often instant. But let's say you're in a zoo and you have bars. What if the bars break? The moment the fear comes, it's not the thought, the fear that it might happen makes it happen. Reality is constantly expressing what comes out of you as desire or as impulse. And if it takes a personal form, I want to eat, I want to hit, I want to push back, I want to conquer, it takes these forms of instant impulse to try to satisfy the impulse. So when you are in the vital world, it's very easy to seduce you. Let's say some beings come, they want to trap you. What do? They just feed your impulse, they feed your desire and suck you into them. So one of the things which happens, you enter a world which is, let's say, in the world of desires, satisfying to you, attractive to you. Let's take a step back. When you enter the dream state, which domain do you enter? That which you resonate with most. So let's say during the day you had strong desires of a certain kind, to eat a certain food, to have a certain kind of satisfaction. You go to sleep with that, you find in your vital body wandering in that domain. And of course all the food is laid out. All the things which you desire and need satisfaction for is out there. And then, if there are beings which want to trap you, they will say, here, come, enjoy our food. It's all available to you. And as you enter into the satisfaction of the desire, you get sucked into their world. And if the impulse is strong enough, you get so immersed in the satisfaction, you forget yourself. Because that's the nature of the vital. And this is where the danger comes. You can be so lost that you forget yourself. Fortunately, you are deeply rooted in your physical body, and a shock of the physical or the physical body saying, enough now, I need to wake up, it drags you back. But if you did not have that link and you were wandering in the vital world, you could lose yourself for years in that satisfaction and enjoyment, and not realize that so much time has passed. In fact, when you get so fed up with that satisfaction that you say, oh, I'm sick of it now, your consciousness would disengage from that realm of experience. And if at that moment there's another desire that rises up, you'll get sucked into that desire world and that experience. This is what happens to people when they first leave the physical body in time of death. In the vital body, you get sucked into the very impulses and desires which are characterizing your personality. The desires you have when you were leaving the body, they are all there right before you, forming your world, forming your experience. The miser who is thinking of what happens to my treasure, my money, what will happen to it, and his fixation on it keeps him bound to that experience of, and suddenly he experiences, people are coming to take away my money, someone's knocking at the door, oh, the whole house is shaking, they're going to break the house and steal my money. And the moment the fear comes, that reality is what he experiences, and he is sucked into it. And again the whole thing happens, and his fear ends up in exhaustion. I'm tired of the fear dims and the events become quiet. After a while, when the energy is regenerated, again the fear comes up and again the thing starts. And the cycle goes so many times until some part of his consciousness stands back and says, but every time I fear, it's happening. Does it need to be like that? Can I refuse to be afraid? And he may make the effort and suddenly find himself free. Or some deeper part of the soul's influence pushes into the vital, seizes upon this tendency, pulls back. The mind steps in and says, but I don't need to have this. And when he becomes free of this fear pattern, he moves to the next step, and the next, and the next. This is the reason why in the Christian tradition they refer to this passage as purgatory. You are purging out all your desires, as if. It's a very slow process. It's not nice at all. If only you could go straight to something higher. Touch straight your deeper and higher aspirations. And you can do that if at the time of leaving the body, your mind is dwelling on those things. Then even if the vital has all those tendencies, which is the more dominant state of your consciousness, that's the one into which you are drawn at the time of leaving the body. And that's why so much importance to the state in which you leave the body. Not only that, the mother, as you're familiar, most of you would know, it was part of the mother's work to create a kind of a safe passage, linking the time of leaving the body to certain higher ranges of consciousness, so that the soul could pass through this otherwise confusing purgatory phase straight into that. But I'm describing this in detail because if you look at that passage in the vital body, it is also somehow representative of our passage in the physical life, in the physical world. Consider our character when we were, let's say, late teenage or coming into early adulthood. What is your primary drive to do things? Your desire. Desire impulse and satisfaction of desire impulse. You do something until you get fed up with it. Okay, I've had enough of this now. Then you move to the next. Then you move to the next. Only when you have exhausted all of them that you start looking for, is there a deeper meaning? Is there something more satisfying, more lasting, more true? Having exhausted everything, you kind of move to something higher, which corresponds closer to your mental aspirations. Even in your physical life, we pass through a similar phase, and then in the mental life, or in the mental part of the physical life, again you may have steps. Unless something of the deeper soul influence or a spiritual influence touches you, and suddenly you make a jump. But you may still have parts in you which are pulling and pushing for their satisfaction. And all of this is to show that what we experience in the vital world in itself is also what we experience in the physical life, because the vital body is of that character. But when you are in the vital world without the physical body, the whole thing is completely exposed. And so desire and satisfaction of impulse are therefore the first law of this world of sheer vital existence. Everything is formed by desire and satisfaction of impulse. And this poise of relations between the soul and its nature, in which the life power plays with so much greater a freedom and capacity than in our physical living. But in our physical living, the same life energy is much less free, much less capable. Here it is completely freed up. It may be called the desire world, for that is its principal characteristic. Remember, the same vocabulary Sri Aurobindo uses, the ego sense we have is the desire soul. Because largely the center of our ego identity is in the vital, not of the vital. And our desire nature is what we feel ourselves to be first and foremost. Moreover, it is not fixed in one hardly variable formula as physical life seems to be, but is capable of many variations of its poise, admits many subplanes, ranging from those which touch material existence and, as it were, melt into that, to those which touch at the height of the life power the planes of pure mental and psychic existence and melt into them. Now, since the vital world is not primarily made of rigid form, there are many relationships the soul can have with its own desire patterns, with its own drive of satisfaction of impulse. There are, we can say, many gradations of impulse, narrow, rigid impulses, or wide, inclusive impulses, or impulses of selflessness, again narrow or wide. And each of these would have a different quality of energy or desire. And the soul can have a range of such variations, and according to the range of variations, you can actually experience the whole world differently. And this makes possible a great fluidity in the formula of formula, meaning the way forms are cast. Unlike, he says, the physical world, which is physical life, which is a hardly variable formula, it seems, he says. So I'm going to explore this a little bit. In the vital world, let's say, you live in this very narrow, dark, dull passion, heat of passion, and the experience of the world is narrow, dark, dull, heat of passion. You rise into great clarity, selfless, joy, wide, embracing, inclusive energy, and the whole world is this clear, bright, wide, even loving in its expression. And so you can have a full spectrum of domains of this kind, depending on the state of consciousness. In the physical world, you cannot do that. I'm feeling low, the whole world becomes grey, to my personal subjective experience. I'm feeling bright and happy, all the colors are somehow brighter. But since it is a much more rigid formula, I can say, oh, the world is grey, but you will say, no, it's bright. You are just depressed. So the range of variation is very small, it's not so objective. Actually, he says, it seems. In fact, subjectively we do feel this variation, but also there is an objective variation because your physical senses also widen or narrow. When, for example, you are more bright, more cheerful, more happy, your hearing becomes sharper, your sight becomes also more keen, and there is a expansion in the band of experience, or a narrowing and dulling in the band of experience. But it's not so obvious. We are still pretty much in the same objective space. If you want a completely different experience, you have to carve out a different space. So you go into the ocean, it's a different experience. You fly in the air, it's a different experience. You go to the top of a mountain, the vibes are very different. In a forest, it's different. But they are physical locations because forms are fixed. But in the vital world, you do not need to go to places. Right here where you are, you can shift your state and experience the vital world differently. And so you have the experience as if many gradations of vital world, many planes and subplanes, and you can as if tune into them. You do not have that in the physical world. Physical world, you have to go to different locations to have that kind of separation of experience. So, it's capable of many variations of its poise and admits many subplanes. And the range he gives, at the lowest, it's as if the vital world turns more and more to the realm of form. The energy which is free now as if binds itself into the form of its expression, and it approaches the physical and melts into the physical. This phrasing he uses is very suggestive, which touch material existence and as it were melt into that. And on the other side, to those which touch at the height of the life power the planes of pure mental and psychic existence and melt into them. So touch and melt into them is very suggestive. What it shows you, what he's describing here, are some of the planes which merge into the physical as if. So the vital energy becoming more and more densified, more and more rigidified, approaches a point where it's almost of the same character as the physical, and you actually share in the objectivity of the physical world. So the vital body, free completely, would probably not see this thing as it is. It will see an energy of flower, energy of another thing. Energy is mixing, blending into each other. But when you shift down to the lower gradation, you actually see the energy is concretizing and being bound in form. The difference though, you're still more in the vital world. So I still see this flower, it is red, but when I look at the flower and I concentrate on what the flower feels, or I speak to the flower, this flower moves. And it moves actively. The petals move and wave at me in that vital gradation close to the physical. Or the flower now starts growing large and it develops eyes and a mouth and speaks. I say, wow, what is this? I must be in a dream, or I must be on drugs. And that's actually the connection you will see shortly. Or the flower now takes on a very different form. It takes on the form of a creature. And the creature now, depending on the relationship of fear I have, the creature may now grow large and say, I'm going to eat you up. And it starts chasing me and I start running. Anything could happen. The form is fluid and yet there is this form. Or simply, I might find the flower melts and flows like a liquid and moves around. Now these are all descriptions which you will find are common to people who have taken certain drugs. And in the first experience of the drug hitting, you still see the physical world, and then in the physical world these vital gradations now begin to be accessed, very close to the physical world. And so it's still the physical objects, except now they start changing form. And all these descriptions which I made are common to those who have taken those kinds of drugs. But what it tells you is, all these planes are accessible to us as we are in the lower ranges of the vital. And often in dream state, these are the ones that we tend to wander in. Depending on our mood, they may have a darker slant or a brighter slant. But that's about all. They're still of that denser grade. We rarely go into the pure vital plane. If you enter the pure vital plane, forms become so fluid as to become almost meaningless. And at that point, your dream has those weird kinds of experience where I was feeling this great happiness, and then this happened, and then I was somewhere else, and then I was somewhere else. Forms are as if somehow immaterial, just series of emotional states that you wander in. And those are difficult to remember, because we're still used to thinking of things in terms of forms. And when you transcribe the memory of that dream, you tend to bind it into form. But most of the dreams are in this realm of the vital as it blends into the physical. Most of the access from below through drugs is also in this domain. Within this domain, of course, you have the hells as well as the heavens, depending on the quality of consciousness. So Mother speaks of this. Maybe if we have time, we will read from some of those descriptions. On the other side, as it enters the mental domain, what happens there, it's as if touching thought and awareness of thought. And there you find you are much more conscious, less driven by desire. You have desire, but first you have awareness which moves into desire. And there you can control things much more easily. In the vital plane proper, you cannot control things unless you are a master of your desire. And this is the reason why the vital world is so dangerous. You enter there, all your desires are exposed, and you just become helplessly a toy of the impulses. But if you enter the mental domain, you must still have the part of the vital which has desire, but with awareness which is more strong than desire. As in the physical body, form is more strong than the life impulse. So you are protected. So too in the mental plane, if awareness is stronger than desire, you have a desire, but you have the ability to restrain, to hold back, or even change your states of desire. And those are the realms also where often we have dreams, where certain experiences of some insight or knowledge, some problem which you had before you went to sleep and you have a solution, you see it in some form. You will recall the famous incident in science where a chemist was looking for the solution to the molecular structure of the benzene ring. And he couldn't explain it because they were looking for chains of molecules and it wouldn't explain the character of benzene. And in the dream that night, he saw a large number of molecules holding hands and dancing in a circle. And he woke up and he said, yes, it has to be a ring, and that solves the problem. This is typical of the vital mental bridge. So the desire was his drive to know and to feel, to experience, and in the mind was the awareness content in it which represented that in the ring form. That was enough to get his solution. It's in that borderline where we have what we call lucid dreams. Because the awareness is higher than the desire impulse, you are not an automaton of desires. You are aware and can restrain and modify desires. But the moment that starts happening, one tends to slip back into the desire part and again submerged into the automatism of it. So if one had to train to be able to consciously explore these worlds, you can see obviously the first requirement would be complete control over your emotions and your thoughts. A kind of a practical self-mastery of emotions and thoughts is essential if you are to be able to safely wander those domains. Otherwise, you are just a victim driven by the impulsiveness of your desires, or you cannot even enter the higher realm of the mental vital regions to become conscious enough to navigate. So in the practices involved in many of these occult schools, for training you to go out of the body, the first training they give you is in daily life. To be conscious at each moment of your emotions, of your impulses, of the desires, of the thoughts. First step is, of course, to be conscious. Second step is to be able to modulate, moderate. And I have a desire, I redirect it consciously, give to it a purpose and direction which is higher than instinctive. As long as you are in the instinctive bundle, in the dream state you will be a victim of the instinctive pull-push. You will not awake to the fact that you are conscious. And so the desire itself should never be allowed to flow. It should be always restrained, always a conscious choice. Even if you allow an indulgence, the conscious awareness and will is restraining, like horses tied to the chariot with the reins fully in hands, not one dip, not one blip of movement away from the conscious awareness, holding everything in its grip. This is the basic training in waking life, into which is infused the sense of awareness, to be conscious, and whatever objects you wish to have in the out-of-body state. Now, if a person has worked upon this sufficiently, almost without any other effort, in the dream state you will find you're master of your emotions, thoughts, you're navigating or controlling the dream events, but not yet fully conscious in it. So you add that intentionality to become conscious, and then spontaneously you have the dream where you're conscious. So this is a very basic kind of training. The next part of the training will be how to consciously enter that state, how to consciously exteriorize your awareness. And of that, Mother has a very interesting passage. All of this she has explained. If you read her instructions in the classes that she took with the children, all of this training was part of what she gave to people, except nobody recognized the value of it. They just took it as a basic moral training. Oh yeah, I should be good, I should restrain my emotions, my desires and my thoughts. No, it's much more than that. It's a base of self-mastery which gives you access to a much larger realm of reality. So the next part of the training is to be able to exteriorize, and for that Mother explains how you do it. First she says, you should be able to focus all your awareness on a single grade of consciousness. This is interesting. What is the grade in which we live normally? If you observe, it's a wandering mix of many planes. In a large part, like I said, the impulse of desire. I'm sitting and the desire impulse comes, let me switch on TV. I'm sitting, desire impulse comes, let me open a book. Desire impulse, let me pick up the phone, check, is there a message? Let me call someone. The desire impulse came up and you followed. As long as you're doing that in waking life, this is what you will replicate in dream state. So instead, as soon as the desire impulse comes, you become conscious, it is there. You stand back, separate. And then consciously with awareness make an action, even if the action is required. You want to pick up something, you want to take a sip of water, you will now do it with full deliberateness of awareness, at no point allowing automatism to slip in. So one of the practices is hold this expanded, utter conscious awareness in which you're aware of everything around you, not fixing on any particular thing. You'll notice in the dream state, if you are in a lucid dream state, you say, oh, I am conscious, and that's so interesting, your mind fixates and you get sucked and you're out of your lucidity. So in your waking state, you train to remain fully aware of everything equally, not allowing your attention to fixate on anything. Okay? So all of this is part of the first level training. Now second level training is of going out of the body consciously. Can you narrow down to the particular band of awareness in this whole fluctuating range? So I have my physical sensations, my awareness of sensations, my desire impulses, awareness of desire impulses, then my pure awareness of thought and turning to whatever objects or ideals. And in this full spectrum, identify one grade and hold your awareness in that grade, in that state. So obviously here we want to enter into the mental vital worlds, not in the pure vital. And so you are as if conscious, holding awareness of this poise, not allowing anything else below to pull you, and you hold the state as long as you can. Practice remaining in it persistently. So one of the forms in which they suggest to practice this, you go for a walk. You're aware of everything around you. You're not lost in your subjective thought, emotions, daydream, because that's what you will do in the dream state then. You're aware of everything around you, but equally, no fixation on any point. And then hold that poise of aware, mental, vital, with the senses plugged in. And hold that poise sustained for whatever duration of time. And it's a skill of being able to narrow down and hold that poise, not allowing it to shift. When you have mastered this, already in many dreams you will find yourself spontaneously becoming conscious. But now the method Mother says, you relax your body completely. In order to be able to disengage from the physical body, you must be able to let the physical body as if go to sleep, as if, but not actually go to full sleep. Because when it goes to full sleep, it sucks your consciousness out also. So the key is body asleep, mind awake. But which part of the mind? And you hold this poise. But it's not your surface mind. It's not the surface mind plugged into your senses. It's the grade of mind now turned into the inner realm of senses. So it's as if you withdraw from the physical engagement of the body. Your body goes into a kind of a sleep-like state, but your awareness has to remain on that narrow band without physical senses. This is the skill now. If you've practiced doing this during the day, you can get to this easily. And then you hold this poise, staying in it. And when the body is sufficiently relaxed, you'll find your awareness as if separating. Now in the practice Mother speaks of, she says, it's best to exit through the heart center. You can actually exit through any of the centers, any of the chakras. But if you go through the lower centers, you are likely to enter into those grades of consciousness, the realms of the lower vital. But the heart center is the point, let's say the higher emotions, where the mental vital is joined. So that would be the center. You could also go through the center of the forehead, which is the second option, which is much more mentalized consciousness. Some people used to go out from the head. She said it's very dangerous, because that's also the exit passage for the soul's exit from the body. So you don't use that normally. But one of these two centers, depending on your temperament, and you center yourself there entirely, hold your awareness as the body goes into its state of sleep. Your awareness is no more plugged into the physical senses, and you as if extend into it, the pure grade of awareness, your senses open into it. That's when you find yourself in the world. Now what's interesting is, you chose a certain grade of consciousness to enter. You could modulate that. So you could choose to enter in a slightly lower grade or a slightly higher grade, depending on the state that you hold in yourself, the thought, the aspiration, the images of reference which you use. So in the occult schools, they teach you to associate states of consciousness with symbols. So they will speak, for example, of the world of the wind element. So you actually conceive of, picture, hold these images, these words, these sounds, these colors, to focus on that domain. Or something else will be the domain of the fire element. But these are very indirect methods of associating a domain with a symbol. Sometimes they fixate so much that you do not even understand the principle behind it. So in a particular school, they will say, if you enter through a portal which is of this name or of this deity, then that's the world you enter. This name, this deity is associated with that world. Why? You don't know. Because you do not recognize that actually you are associating with a state of consciousness. But being part of the school, when you accept the belief systems of the school, you plug into their symbols, and those become active for you and effective for you. But the pure spiritual approach would be to be able to modulate the grade of consciousness before you enter the awareness of the world. But equally, you can do it the other way. Entering the world and experiencing it, you can then densify, move to a denser grade, or move up into a higher grade. Again, as a skill, it's something which you could train yourself in your waking consciousness to consciously shift levels into pure thought, and then shift into thought, emotion, then emotion proper, desire, impulse, and then something which is almost physical. And shift your grades of consciousness. But if you can manage within this narrow band of human awareness, you can also extend a little higher and enter higher states or deeper inner psychic states. A similar thing can happen when you are exteriorized in the mental vital world. From there shift more into the mental, more into the vital, or inward to the psychic, or turn to a spiritual aspiration within that state of consciousness. And you will be as if tuning into different planes, different worlds or gradations within that. I've described it in a way in which you will see it's so logical. The whole process and even the steps of training is so logical. But it's a lot of work It's a lot of training. And the same energy which you could put to develop this capacity, the same energy you will see in the initial stage could be used to also make conscious, to awaken in your consciousness a deeper or higher aspiration, or to make conscious to open and align with your deeper psychic aspiration, or awaken the aspiration for the higher spiritual light and consciousness of the mother to fill, to form, to reshape, to transform. The same quantum of effort turned in a spiritual direction would liberate the consciousness, purify, spiritualize, psychicize, transform it. Or with the same effort you would develop a capacity to access and develop skills of entering and experiencing the vital mental worlds, but with no obvious change in spiritualization or psychicization. And so you make a choice, obviously. But you will see the elements of training are common. And as a result, the spiritual purification of these planes or these states within us naturally, almost effortlessly, can also give you access to an entry into those worlds or those experiences, but need not. Unless some part of you turns in interest to explore that exteriorization movement may not happen. And so, as a result of a spiritual growth, sometimes the occult possibilities also open if there is a tendency in that direction, or you could consciously choose to open them, or you can simply ignore them and continue this as your priority. But the spiritual gives you the access to the occult, but the development in the occult may not give you the spiritual training at all, or the spiritual change at all. But you'll see the common factor, the common element of the training. So that he speaks now of many sub-planes, ranging from those which touch the material existence and as it were melt into it. And the idea of melt is, at some point you cannot distinguish one from the other. The most obvious so-called out-of-body experiences are the ones that take place in one of these planes, sub-planes closest to the physical. Because then you can see physical things and people just like this, and yet you are in a subtle body. When you go proper into the vital mental domains, then you will call it dream, you will not call it out-of-body experience. So the distinction is really of a very, only of gradation. When we have people who are trained to spy through these methods, they call it remote viewing, then it is on these planes that you are accessing. So just as the vital can melt into the physical, the mental also can melt into the physical. So mostly what happens in remote viewing is you're projecting in the mental consciousness rather than the vital, and the part of the mental which is close enough to physical is what you experience. At that point there's very little danger, because the mental consciousness is naturally plastic, naturally free, does not have any of the dangers of impulsiveness of the vital. It can be very detached and objective in its perception, and because it is already so free and fluid, you are not putting a part of you out of the physical body. So there's no danger also to your life. A part of the mind projects, it sees, perceives, and that's it. The work is done. But if you try to project yourself in the vital body, a part of the vital has to go out, and the physical body often goes into a state of trance. Depending on what grade you have projected out, if it is very close to the material, there is the danger that if in your projected consciousness there is a knock, it can reflect in the physical body, because it is of the same density of vibration. An injury to the projected body harms your physical body. And if at that point the link in between is cut, you will find yourself unable to get back. Effectively then your body is dead. So the dangers are much greater when there is an exteriorization in the lower ranges of the vital and physical domains. But in the projection of the mind, there is no such danger. And so a lot of these practices which people make for purpose of knowledge are mostly in this domain of the mental range. Again, it can be very close to the physical if you want to explore only the physical world. There are some fascinating stories from the military research that was done by the CIA in remote viewing. And one of the most famous psychics who was hired for this work, his name is Ingo Swann. He recorded some of his experiences. Many of the military projects were classified, some of them have been declassified, more than 10,000 documents. Officially, the US military shut down the project. Unofficially, they transferred it into what they call deep black projects, so that they are not answerable to anybody, and that continues even to this day. But in this official domain, what they developed was fascinating. Ingo Swann records how, at one point he got bored with his exercises. They were too basic. They asked him to project, to observe marketplaces and things. He said, come on, I can go anywhere in the universe. Why bother with this? And they had just had a news item of a probe from NASA which was heading for Jupiter. And he said, well, let me go to Jupiter and see. So he makes this conscious intention, relaxes his body, projects himself out, and goes to Jupiter. And he describes there's this movement of moving, there's a sense of moving at very high speed. Now this is typical when a part of the consciousness is exteriorized. There is the sense of movement. If there has not been exteriorization and only a direct attention turning, like a mirror turning to become aware, there is no movement. You simply are aware and that's it. So there's no danger. But there is a partial exteriorization. He goes there, but he's able to describe physically because he's very close to the physical plane, and he finds himself standing on something which is fluid but dense. And then trying to feel the material, he said it's some kind of, it feels like hydrogen. Now what does it mean? If you had to feel something, how would you call it? It feels like, and you can only feel like something which is familiar to you. This feels like, this feels like standing on marble. It feels like I'm standing on plastic because you've already had the experience. How does it get to feels like hydrogen? So either there's a strong intuitional component or there's a part in him which recognizes by familiarity the vibration of that substance. But it feels metallic, he says. Then he looks up and he sees almost like a band of crystalline, diamond-like dots sprinkled around in the sky. And so on. He describes, if I recall right, 12 different, very distinct things like this. Later the probe reaches, I think about a few months later, and out of those 12, 7 were confirmed. Subsequently, in the coming decades, a further 3 at least were confirmed. So 10 out of 12. And among them was the confirmation that the surface of Jupiter has such a high pressure that hydrogen itself is squeezed until it becomes metallic. And the scientists now describe it as metallic state of hydrogen, which forms the physicality of the dense part of the core of Jupiter. And he also describes how in the distance he saw mountains. At that point, scientists said, it's not possible. There is nothing hard, no persistent rigidity. It has to be primarily liquid or gaseous. And much later, a few decades later, they confirmed, yes, there are in fact portions which are mountainous and with rigidity that stays mountainous and so on. So it's fascinating as an experience. A similar thing he describes also projecting himself to the moon and seeing things on the moon, then on Venus and Mars. In certain cases, when he projected himself on the moon, he even found beings, human-like bodies who were working there, some mining operation going on, obviously extraterrestrial. And in one case, when he found himself projected, he was looking at them, and out of curiosity, he approached this person, wondering what is he doing. And the person turns around and looks at him straight and points to him and shouts, there's somebody here. So that person had the ability of perceiving someone else in an out-of-body condition, recognizing him. And so the fear in Ingo Swann was so great, he pulled back, came back, and that whole thing was shut down. The military asked him to stop this experiment. But what was interesting is, because he had projected himself, he could be detected. But if it was done in a purely mental consciousness, without a vital exteriorization, the mind simply turns, becomes aware, and like a mirror reflects an image of whatever exists anywhere in the universe. You have not gone somewhere. And there is no way for them to know that you are there. So these are just some interesting observations, but the rationale of it now you understand in this description of Sri Aurobindo, that literally from the vital domain there is a denser gradation which melts as if all the way into the most physical part. Again, the implications of this are extraordinary. It means there is physical substance which is related to vital world, isn't it? So in the flower, there is a part of the flower which is purely material. That's the molecule which you measure. But there's a part of the living part of the flower which is equally as if connected with vital substance, or belongs partly to the vital world while still forming the flower. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. What makes for the flower to be alive is the life energy. You withdraw the life energy, the whole flower will just wither and die. Physically, its weight does not change. But something has gone, isn't it? So there is a vital, as if substantiality, or a physical world which turns to the vital, or the vital world which melts into the physical, and there is a gradation in between which is vital physical, which makes for the physical basis of life in the flower. Now, if that substance is depleted, the flower will wilt. If that substance is amplified, the flower will be fresh and bright. Now, if that substance also connects to something still higher gradation of a spiritual influence or a vital or a mental influence, it can even shape, mold this substance, which is vital physical. Mother comments on how she would give the flower, somebody holds it, and within half an hour the flower has faded. Other people keep the flower, they hold it, it stays fresh for hours. And it has obviously to do with that vital energy and that particular grade of vital energy. Now here we'll touch upon a few more interesting connections. Mother speaks of the power of materialization. Now you can understand how that would happen. She explains how you create an object, let's say with a density, with the mind first, giving it form or idea of form, and gathering vital energy, and then gathering physical substantiality, densifying it until it becomes a physical object. And of course, the key here will be this part of the vital which touches the physical. If you can hold or form the object on that grade and densify from there, then you can materialize easily. Or similarly, dematerializing would be shifting it in gradation to a level which is of a slightly higher grade of vital physical or physical vital. And it ceases to be physical only. And your instruments and your senses cannot measure it. If it is just on the borderline, you may see the object but your hand will pass through it. Or sometimes you can hold the object but you cannot see it, depending on whether it's more on the physical side or more on the vital side. And it's only a variation in the tuning of the density. And then Mother says something interesting. She says, people who have an affinity with snakes, or rather, she says, people who have this ability to materialize have an affinity with snakes. Why does she mention that? In the snake consciousness, there is a gradation of energy which is very close to this vital physical. In fact, the physical form of the snake is nothing but the materialization of pure energy or force. You see, in the vital plane, if you remove all sense of form, there's only energy and emotion and impulse of emotion or energy, life force. How does an impulse of life force reach out in relation to something? How would you feel it? It goes straight, or if there is resistance, it pushes its way through resistance. That's the way the snake moves. The snake is literally a physical articulation of this character of the vital energy working in a very dense grade. Every animal, remember, represents or expresses a particular grade of consciousness. And its whole body, function, form, relation with the whole forest ecosystem represents that grade of consciousness. And the snake represents particularly this grade, very close to matter, therefore. It stays on the ground, lives inside the earth, very symbolic even in its working, moves in this slithering form, has no projections of arms and legs, which are all energetic projections finally. It is only a single one-pointed energy. Now you'll see in movies, often in fantasy movies, they will show you this. Somebody shoots an arrow and it goes like a snake, or they shoot a snake and it goes and hits a person. In fact, this is a representation of the experience in the vital. In the vital world, if a pure energy approaches you, the most obvious way it is represented to your perception is a snake form. So that's why in the dream state we say snakes symbolize forces. But the quality of the force, the quality of consciousness of the force will then appear in the variation of form. So a snake which is very dark would represent a dark force, closed to light. Whereas a snake which is, or a force which represents a higher impulse, would appear like a golden colored snake. And the feel of it, the vibe of it would be very different, and so on. So Mother's observation of this connection with people having an affinity with an animal is very interesting, because it means in that person there is that grade of energy which is very developed. And so they feel affinity with all creatures of that grade of energy. Now I'm going into this in some detail because here also you gain the key to understanding the basis for many occult rituals. So you can actually build a formula, take a little bit of this flower, which represents what? That particular grade of life force with these characteristics, which are reflected in its physical color. Obviously it's a reflection. Take a little bit of this flower, mix in a little bit of that other substance, which represents that force or that grade of consciousness and those qualities. Arrange it in this particular pattern which represents this relationship of energies, and you will have this particular outcome. That's the logic of most of the rituals. Pick an object which associates with a particular grade of consciousness. Arrange the object in a way that represents a particular alignment with other energies or grades of consciousness, and you have created an experience in quality of consciousness, force, and therefore its material result. Very simple. So snake in this case would have a very specific representation in the symbol. There is unfortunately I never went into too much of these kinds of formulas. Many of them are pretty murky. But there are some things which are more spiritually inclined. Those are more obvious to look at. The flower which Mother has named power, red, bright. Why does she name it power? Because it represents the psychic vibration turned to expressing power. And the flower is the part of the tree which represents its psychic consciousness in the quality that is power. Obviously it is red because that's how power represents itself in the physical domain. Interestingly, is precisely the flower that is offered to Durga during Durga Puja, because it represents the aspect of power of Durga. Similarly, the white color physically represents a particular quality of consciousness, of purity. And so every color has, as if corresponding to it, or rather is reflective of a psychological quality. And when you see the flowers as Mother has named them, it's consistent. The colors are consistent across all the flower types and variations. Now tomorrow we could create a flower. You could take a flower which does not have a white color and genetically modify it to have a white color. And what you will find is it expresses that same quality which was there before, but in its aspect of purity. Or if you entered the flower consciousness and amplified that particular quality of consciousness by willing it, the flower would grow to become a white of the species. Interesting. You could go both ways. Tweak the form in the physical world to express that particular quality of consciousness, or tweak the consciousness in the vital world and the physical form would have that particular quality. So the rationale for most of these, let's say now we want to create rain. What is the gradation of consciousness of the rain energy which triggers rain energy? The beings which play on or cause rain are of that grade of consciousness. What material in nature corresponds to that vibration? Pick up that material. What represents the process of condensation which makes for the precipitation of rain? Introduce that experience on that material. And then you have created rain, or you have at least triggered those forces which create rain. And there's always an element of intentionality. Where, when, how. The mind infusing that intention, of course, has a huge play in the whole game. There was an interesting incident I had seen, I had read of, in a book of a Native American medicine man, as they call it, healer, spiritual leader, we'll say. And he had a natural affinity with thunder. And so he was given the name Rolling Thunder. And it was often the experience, whenever he was around, people would hear thunder in the distance, no clouds in the sky. But he demonstrated one thing. He said there's a particular beetle, I believe it is the dung beetle, and he said there's a strong affinity between this beetle and lightning. So he demonstrated, and it's recorded in the book, he flipped the beetle upside down, and with a feather. Now the feather is very important because that's his tool of action. And the feather has to be taken in a particular way in their system. But you see, the point is not how they got the feather or what feather. It represents his tool of willpower on the symbol of the beetle, which has relation to the lightning. And with the feather, he tickles the belly of the beetle. And the author of the book records, every time he scraped the belly of the beetle with his feather, there was a flash of lightning in the sky. Flash, flash, flash. Literally as if the sky is connected with the beetle. So obviously there's an element of intentionality linking, but this is the link point which is easiest to connect to. The rationale is so obvious once you begin to look at it in terms of gradations of consciousness. Even in the physical world, if you wanted to guide the lightning as electricity, well, you would use a metal which is conductive. So you will say, this metal has affinity to contain or to carry that particular energy. If you think in those terms, all the qualities of physical materials are just that. They are vehicles or containers for gradations of consciousness and their forces. And when you make a physical arrangement, in my electric circuit I have put copper to carry the lightning, electricity. The magician will say, your physics is nothing but a very narrow application of my knowledge. You have used copper. Obviously, copper has an affinity with that. And your physicist will say, oh no, copper is a conductor of electricity. What are you saying? It's the same thing in different words. But in words which are narrow and reduced in a perspective that is very reductionist. The truth is, copper is conductive because it has affinity to electrical energy. And that's why it's conductive. You can look at it from the other way, top down rather than bottom up. So what you see is physical science is a very narrow band of knowledge of a much broader, we may call occult science, which is itself only an articulation of this larger spiritual knowledge, which Sri Aurobindo is pointing here in its most essential form and revealing its most essential aspects. Now, I have gone quite far from the simple line of multiple levels melting into matter, but it was a purely logical chain. Some of these things which I have already spoken of, he later develops in more detail. He speaks of how all the planes of existence blend into each other, and which makes for an extraordinary continuum. There are no sharp gaps in nature. Everything blends into everything. And this has such extraordinary implications. But for now, we stop with this idea that in our physical body, there is the part which is purely physical. There is no such thing. There is largely physical with very little vital and mental. So we call it purely physical. And then there is the purely vital, again, blended with other things. But then in between there's a whole range of gradations of substance which are vital physical and melting into each other literally. So there's actually a substance which has a character of physicality, density of physicality, but it is mostly vital physical substance. And when this substance, or rather this substance is critical to the health of your physical body, when this substance is depleted, your health will tend to degrade, all the cellular functions will tend to decline, be less effective, less efficient. But the same substance is also under influence of your mental awareness. And so your thought patterns will shape its, which can accumulate, can direct, can change its quality. So if you concentrate on your palm, focus on a particular point in the palm, feel that and put into that feel the intention to heat up. And you concentrate for a while, after a while that part begins to become warmer. Why? Because your mind awareness influencing the vital substance acts upon the physicality of it until it has a physical result. But you could equally feel the warmth in the vital substance only and with no physical result. And if you did that, you'll find yourself always hot internally. But physically your temperature is normal, and it may lead to even problems of a certain type. Or the sense of heat you could simply reshape to experience a sense of energism, vitality, optimism even. It's a kind of a heat, but a more lit up heat, a light of heat rather than hotness of the heat. And we use the word tapas, which is a more specific term, there's no equivalent in English language, which contains both the light and heat concept, and you can modulate between the two. The whole thing is tapas. So content of tapas increasing, you could shape it as heat or light and even bring it to a level of physical density to change the body temperature. Or even cause as if a kind of a glow around the physical body. All of which are experiences well documented. Even we have a natural, spontaneous perception of it when we say he's looking very bright today. There's actually a radiance in the vital body which we are registering in a subliminal vital perception, not conscious here, but that's how the aura actually looks, more glowing. It means also your physical senses can expand a few notches up to perceive this substance, to engage with it. Not only you can feel it internally, you can project it out of you. A lot of healing, especially involving a very dense grade of energy, involves transmission of energy and even substance of energy into the patient. Or you can even conceive of measuring some of these effects physically. And again, that also has been done in the laboratory, except they don't have a model for explanation. Or you can take it a step further. If the vital body has a close to substantiality, then when it separates from the physical body, you should be able to measure a difference in the body weight. And there are experiments which claim that at the time of death, the physical body actually loses about 2 grams. About 2 grams. Maybe the experiment was flawed. Maybe this is actually the physicality of the vital body when it separates, which is lost. Or there is even the possibility of creating machines which are primarily physical but with a certain vital content, by which through a physical process which is almost machine-like, you produce vital results. Change the energetic environment by something physically. Well, obviously the form is you put plants around, the vital environment changes. But can you do the same thing by a physical machinery, by pulsing at certain frequencies, Potentially, there's a scope for even a technology by which you could intensify life force in the body through a machine rather than through another human being channeling it. So you see the realm of possibilities which open up the moment you accept this life force melting into physicality, or physical world joining with the vital or mental in a continuum. It's a very important observation which he has made. Touch and melt, which means literally you can have a contact with and influence on across realms. And on the other extreme, pure mental and psychic existence, and melting into those equally. So we can conceive of physical substance or psychic influence touching the physical substance and filling it, filling the vital substance, and it would have a different feel. For in nature, in the infinite scale of being, there are no wide gulfs, no abrupt chasms to be overleaped, but a melting of one thing into another, a subtle continuity. Out of that, a subtle continuity. Out of that, her power of distinctive experience creates the orderings, the definite ranges, the distinct gradations by which the soul variously knows and possesses its possibilities of world existence. So the reality, he says, is that in nature, there is the infinite scale of being, no large gaps. Everything is smooth and continuous. But where does the sense of distinction come? Out of that, her power of distinctive experience creates the orderings, definite ranges, distinct gradations. So nature has a continuity in substance, but she is able to somehow create a sensation of distinction. So let's take a few examples of this. You look at the sky, there's a continuity of air from here all the way to the clouds. But warm layer of air below, trapped under a cold layer of air. Normally cold air is heavier, it tends to sink to the ground, and the warm air tends to rise. But occasionally the ground heats up the air below, and the warm air tries to rise up, and the cold air above, which is a very large chunk, is trying to sink below. And the two kind of get stuck. Of course, after a while, they blend into each other and mix. But for quite a while, there is this inversion of temperature. And if you notice, if you take your finger through, it's warm here, and you cross the threshold, suddenly it's cold there. And the transition is quite sudden. Because they're distinct experiences, although the air is in a continuity. Or let's say the two got reversed. Finally, the cold air came down. You have a cold air, you climb up, and suddenly it becomes warm. When you look at a mountain, especially a tall mountain, you will see a line of the snow. Anything below that, the snow melts. Anything above that, the snow stays permanent. And it's a very clear line. It's not like here it's gone a little more, there it's gone a little less. It's not a zigzag. It's a clear line. And you notice in a valley, the line is across all the mountain peaks on exactly the same height. How do you explain that? Because there is actually a sudden shift in the temperature, or at least in the phenomenon of expression of temperature. There's a radical transition point. Although the air is the same, although the air is moving from one to the other. If you observe also the formation of a cloud, it's fascinating. In such inversion layers, there's a cloud starting at a certain height. And you will see the cloud as if slowly crossing the line of that height. As it crosses below, it dissipates. But that's the line it maintains, always in appearance of cloud. Very interesting. If you observe a clump of a cloud in an open sky, you will notice one edge is fading out, another edge is growing. Very interesting. That means there is a continuum, there's a continuous exchange across, but there are distinctive passages. And this is what he describes. In nature, in the infinite scale of being, there are no wide gulfs, no abrupt chasms to be overleaped, but a melting of one thing into another, a subtle continuity. First level. But the second level of truth is, out of that, her power of distinctive experience creates the orderings. It's as if nature says, I want to experience this distinctly and that distinctly. And she creates as if a gap in the quality by accumulating, clustering gradations of consciousness or qualities of consciousness. If you go a little bit into this, no wide gulfs, no abrupt chasms to be overleaped, it's not just a poetic vocabulary. He's describing the nature of working of energy, nature, that she never leaves a gap. Everything joins and melts into everything else. Now, this is not only true on a certain grade, let's say the material world, everything fills, there is no vacuum, things just flow into each other, but it is much more true across levels. So, a higher plane inevitably leans down, melts into the lower. Lower plane inevitably tries to rise and touch the higher. When you read Sri Aurobindo Savitri, he has described them, he has mapped out the worlds through Ashwapati's journey through the worlds. And within each world, he maps out the finer gradations. And in each of those worlds, you will find the lower portions of the worlds as if leaning towards matter, and the higher portions leaning to the mind or even beyond to spirit. And this is very interesting because it means that on any plane, there is a part which responds to spirit. There's a part which responds to the psychic, and there's a part which connects to matter on any plane. The implications are extraordinary. And the most important for us is it means the spiritual consciousness can establish itself on any plane and manifest on any plane, including the physical. And it means there is even a gradation of matter which has the quality of the spiritual consciousness and can resonate and hold it most easily. And if within our body that density of matter grows in content, we can receive and hold the full intensity of a spiritual experience. In the same way as today, we have a gradation of matter which can receive and hold the full intensity of the mental experience. We can live in the consciousness of the spirit and experience the Sat Chit Ananda in a completely physical body. But it would mean the physical part of the matter which is able to enter in relation to that should be sufficiently refined and developed. And maybe that part of the evolution has not yet fully completed, which is why it is so difficult. But it just means it is possible and it must happen eventually. So this one idea of the melting of one thing, of everything into everything else, has extraordinary implications when you think about it more deeply. And these distinct gradations are by which the soul variously knows and possesses its possibilities of world existence. If there was not this distinctness of gradation, then you could not have had the richness of experiences. I was looking at an example recently in a news item. They described how scientists had gone deep into the Antarctic Ocean and to a depth of a couple of kilometers where there is no sunlight. And they discovered three distinct worlds. So there is the lowest world where there is no sunlight reaching, and there is a whole complex life which has developed there. Zero sunlight, practically no oxygen. And so the life forms there have adapted to feeding on non oxygen days. And since there is no light, the fish which grow there have no eyes. Interesting. But they put out light. Some of them actually put out light, their body glows. So you don't get sunlight, fine, we will create light. It's as if nature says, I don't need the sun. I can create light wherever it is. And the fish put out light. Some are without eyes, some who have eyes or they have receptors equivalent of eyes actually communicate with light in a completely dark world. And light often is their way of expressing themselves emotionally. I'm happy, so the light pattern glows like that. I'm sad, light becomes dull and non moving, colors become dull. Light is your way of expression. Fascinating world. And then in between, there's an intermediate world where the fish are adapted to low light. They cannot go too high, they will be blinded by the too bright light. They cannot go too low because they will not be able to see. They have adapted only to low light, and their retina is as if tuned in only to seeing gray. Their colors are also more approaching the gray shades and finer variations of gray shades, not other colors. And they live in a very narrow band of temperature in the same continuum of ocean. And then you cross, and suddenly there's a threshold of the upper part of the ocean where you have the more conventional, colorful fish tuned into light, looking up to the light always. This in between layer, interestingly, is designed to reflect light from below. There's some very strange things like that, perfectly optimized to those three bands of worlds. Now, to say that there's a continuum of ocean with changing currents across them, and yet three different gradations of worlds. If you thought about it, if superficially, you would say it's not possible because eventually the temperatures will mix. Eventually the materials will mix. Eventually the life forms will migrate. But it doesn't happen because nature wants to create distinctive experiences. And the soul wants to enjoy these distinctions. And that's why you will see even inside the earth, in the mineral world, you have distinct boundaries where minerals grow and stop growing, and other minerals grow or don't grow at all. And so you have mines of distinct metals. Why isn't it all blended equally everywhere? Because nature wants to create these distinctions. In fact, when you look at certain mines, the vein of metal, it's called a vein because it's very similar to the physical veins inside your body. It's like there's one line which goes a little bit zigzag, splits up into finer lines and goes zigzag and splits up into finer lines. Gold, particularly, they use the word vein because there are literally lines of gold which grow like that. And if you could see the earth in three dimensions, you would see the metals like veins connecting inside physical matter. Nature wants to create distinct boundaries, distinct experiences by which the soul variously knows and possesses its possibilities of world existence. This sense of diversity would not be possible if nature did not make these distinctions. So, again, we are looking at a very important principle of nature's working, of conscious nature's working. If it was all mechanical, if it was all random, there would not be these distinctions of worlds. Nature is conscious and consciously creates distinctions so that the soul can enjoy the full spectrum of possibilities. And then again, enjoyment of one kind or another being the whole object of desire, that must be the trend of the desire world. But since wherever the soul is free, since wherever the soul is not free, and it cannot be free when subject to desire, there must be the negative as well as the positive of all its experience. This world contains not only the possibilities of large or intense or continuous enjoyments almost inconceivable to the limited physical mind, but also the possibility of equally enormous sufferings. It is here, therefore, that there are situated the lowest heavens and all the hells, with the tradition and imagination of which the human mind has lured and terrified itself since the earliest ages. Now, again, Sri Aurobindo takes the whole thing to its logical conclusion. Remember, the character of the vital world is desire. The drive of life is satisfaction of impulse and of desire. So, the whole object of desire is what? Enjoy. Otherwise, there's no point to desire. So he says, enjoyment of one kind or another being the whole object of desire, that must be the trend of the desire world. So, in a desire world, everything is trying to find enjoyment. But when the soul tries to find enjoyment, what happens? If it is free, it can enjoy everything. But if it is bound, then enjoyment is split into the enjoyable and the not enjoyable, the opposite of enjoyable, the suffering. The moment you are unable to enjoy and there's a limit to the enjoyment, that which is beyond that limit becomes suffering. Well, as a simple example, you take a feather and caress the hand and you say, this is pleasant, pleasurable. Now you keep pushing harder and harder, and at some point the feather begins to press so hard, you say, now it's hurting. And if it presses harder, where your finger senses the sensations are unable to register, either the nervous system feels too intense or the cells now begin to break down under the pressure, you say, now it's causing pain. But there's only a continuum. And the continuum divides into pleasure and pain at the border of what you can contain in your experience. The moment he says the soul is unable to be entirely free and it is restricted in some way, there is a split, a division into the positive and the negative. And here the logic again is unavoidable. It cannot be free when subject to desire. So true enjoyment would require the soul to be free of everything, to be able to enjoy freely. But when desire seizes you and binds you, in the physical world, it is form that seizes and binds the soul. In the vital world, it is desire which seizes and limits the soul. Although much more plastic than the physical, but still it creates a division. And so, there must be the negative as well as the positive of all its experience. Now, because the vital world is more plastic than the physical, more elastic, with wider ranges of possible relationships with the energy, this world contains not only the possibility of large or intense or continuous enjoyments, which are not possible in the physical world. In the physical world, no enjoyment can be continuous. The moment you enjoy long enough, your senses begin to be dulled. If nothing else, we will say physiologically, the channels of ion exchange between the cells which carry the signals in your nervous system, the channels get saturated. You keep exchanging too much signal, after a while they get saturated with ions and they will not carry signals. That's the physiological explanation. But if you look at it from a consciousness perspective, too much intensity, too long, tires the system. It cannot hold, it cannot contain. The biology shuts down and begins to become dull and loses sensitivity. And therefore, any enjoyment sustained long enough will lose, eventually become flat, normal, unenjoyable. In fact, think about it. What is your normal? Right now, the wind is caressing your hands. What is normal? Since that is the normal pressure of the air on your hands, we don't feel it anymore because the system has dulled itself to the normalcy that this is. If you shifted to, let's say, higher up the mountain where the air pressure is less, for a while you will feel a little uncomfortable. Once the body adapts, that will become the normal. Then suddenly, when you come down from the high mountains, you'll feel the air much more dense around you. And after a day or so, it will become the normal. So any sensation you have, however pleasant or pleasurable, at some point becomes the norm, and then you feel nothing. It becomes neutral. And you need something more to feel pleasure or pain. So this world contains possibility of continuous enjoyment because there is nothing which dulls the enjoyment, because this is the nature of the world itself, of the impulse of desire. Equally, it is capable of much more intense sensations or emotions, which in the physical body would overload the nervous system and again either make it feel it as pain or simply make it go unconscious and feel nothing. Or he also uses the word large, large enjoyments. Consider what that means in the physical domain. You enter a space. Let's say you enter Disney World. So many things to do. The child looks at it and says, wow, I could spend the whole month, the whole year, I could spend my whole life. The sense of something large, but there's a boundary. And the boundary is the border of the Disney World. I spent a few days, now I've seen everything, there's nothing more left. There's always a finite limit. Because that's the nature of the physical world: form, containing, bounding, therefore limiting. But you enter the vital world where form is secondary. The same enjoyment can take the largeness of the whole universe. No limit to the size. So you can enter a certain state, and the state of consciousness becomes a world which is as big as the universe. So let's say you enter the state of great joy, and the joy fills the whole universe. You enter a state of great sadness, and the sadness fills the whole universe. And every variation of it, fear, joy, love, hate, and all the blending mixes and complexity of nuances, each can be experienced in the size of the whole universe and is a whole universe in itself, of that grade, of that vibration, as a subplane of the vital world. And so you can have large joys. And in each, you can have the full intensity, nothing to burn out in your nervous system, because form is not limiting you. And in each, you can stay in continuous, sustained enjoyment of it. Nothing to cut you back to normalcy. So, here's the interesting thing he says. This world contains not only the possibility of large or intense or continuous enjoyments almost inconceivable to the limited physical mind, but also the possibility of equally enormous sufferings, because the same thing would apply to the negative experience: large, universe wide suffering, universe wide fear, a universe of fear or suffering or pain or sadness or depression. And not only it will be large, it will be intense, again without limit, and sustained without limit. Now imagine you enter the vital world, and all these things are part of the vital world, entire universes of all these experiences. What happens? Where are you naturally attracted to? Like a magnet, that which is your normal state is what you're attracted to, and you find yourself experiencing that world. If you wanted to shift levels, there is no way, because it is the size of the universe. It's not like in the physical world: walk for 1 kilometer here, you'll go out of this world, and then it's sunlight. Climb 100 meters up or 1,000 meters up, and you'll go above the clouds. You can go all the way into infinity, and the whole universe is full of only that sadness. How do you shift? You have no way to do that except by tuning yourself to a different frame, which means what? Within you, you should shift from sadness to joy, and you tune out of the sadness domain to the joy domain and experience the joy which fills the whole universe, or the world of joys, the heavens, we will call them. You become unhappy, and you immediately tune out of the joy world into the unhappiness world, and you enter one of the hells. So the interesting thing is, your state internally is what you tune into in the full range of possibilities of the vital. If you want to shift levels, you should be able to shift levels internally. And that's how you shift externally. Now you see how important it is for you to have mastered your states and to be able to shift consciously. And all of this is necessarily a part of the training to prepare you for wandering or exploring vital worlds. The mother speaks of a time when she was doing this for almost a year. She was exploring every night the vital worlds, going into all the possible domains. And I don't think we will have time today, but for next time we can read from some of those passages. For now, this we will pause here to understand why the character of the vital world is not only these most extraordinary heavenly seeming realms and the most extraordinary hellish seeming realms, but all are necessarily a part of the vital world, because the soul is subject to desire, is not free to enjoy, and therefore there's a division into the positive and the negative. And the character of the desire is wanting to enjoy, whether it is negative enjoyment or positive enjoyment. So we recognize even the worlds of sadness, unhappiness are forms of enjoyment, but a negative enjoyment in which the soul can wallow and choose to stay or find itself bound and stuck, unable to be free from. All of this existing in the vital world reflects and represents itself in our human physical life, in our emotional ranges. And so, similarly, it is in the physical body consciousness that we have to learn to consciously tune ourselves out from unhappiness to joy or sadness. And the great truth we discover is there is nothing which binds us essentially to be unhappy. In fact, at every moment, to be happy is a choice that we make. Happiness is not the result of circumstances, but it is the exercise of a choice. And you can choose to be happy, whatever the circumstances. You can choose to remain always happy, whatever the external situation. But the full range of emotional experiences in the body is only a pale reflection in highly reduced scope, intensity, and continuity inside the physical body of what is actually existing in the vital worlds. And it is here, therefore, that there are situated the lowest heavens and all the hells, with the tradition and imagination of which the human mind has lured and terrified itself since the earliest ages. So we are attracted to those domains which are heavenly, and we are, of course, afraid of those hellish realms. But he says the lowest heavens. So, however beautiful the vital worlds, and they're extremely beautiful, some of them, he calls them the lowest heavens because they're essentially of the character of desire and impulse of desire. There are realms of even greater beauty, but which are free of the desire limitation and therefore are much more wide and truly close to what would be for us the ideal heavens. All human imaginations indeed correspond to some reality or real possibility, though they may in themselves be a quite inaccurate representation or couched into physical images and therefore inapt to express the truth of supraphysical realities. Anything you imagine already exists in the vital domains or mental worlds. But in your attempt to capture it, you tend to reduce too much into the physical form or represent in ways which are limitations of your own, which in which you form it. I remember going to some of the Buddhist temples in Angkor Wat, and they had representations of the hells and the heavens and all the gradations of them very neatly mapped out. I believe it is much more done in the not in the Theravada but in the Mahayana Buddhism, that they describe all these domains and even guide the soul to pass through them towards its liberation from them all. But most of this mapping is of the vital worlds, not even of the mental. When you look at it from the spiritual perspective, how much energy gone into mapping these domains which have so little value in themselves. They have value only when they open to a higher spiritual possibility which can fill and awaken in them that. And the same of the physical domains equally. But in the physical world, all these things above can be represented, although in diminished form. And so we have the possibility to experience the physical, the vital, the mental, and the spiritual all woven into each other in our physical life. We'll pause here and continue this text next time. You can see how, with a few suggestions and a few key principles, Sri Aurobindo encapsulates such a wide knowledge. And if we have the background of those traditions, in themselves, those occult traditions don't explain everything. They just tell you this is how it is. But with this insight that Sri Aurobindo gives, we find the explanation for why those things are. And as a result, we become free of the limitations of those traditions and with a deeper, more universal knowledge and understanding which spans across traditions. It's already late, but we can take up any comments or questions. Yes. About Vaishak Day. Aha. Yes. 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 So I don't know enough about the exact tradition, but the idea generally is that the lunar cycle itself has a greater connection with the vital world. And the moon's phases correspond to tides in the vital world. So when the moon is becoming brighter, physically, in the physical domain, it has no difference. It's just a relation between sun, moon, and earth and light reflected. But in the vital world, it represents a phase where the tides are rising, life energy is rising. And when the moon is fading, then the vital energies are dropping. Now, if you were to plant in the crops, if you were to initiate a movement of life, you would want to catch the growing phase of rising energies. So you plant the seeds at a time when the energy is rising, and the seed will grow most rapidly, reaching a peak when the moon is full. And so the full moon is given great importance in relation to access to the subtle worlds or influence from those worlds on the physical world. Equally, the new moon represents the opposite, the negative influence in that relationship. The eclipse again represents a special alignment which acts as a gateway between worlds. And so, a lot of the ancient traditions used the phase of the moon for opening to higher possibilities. The full moon, in particular, representing access to the highest or purest or brightest ranges of the vital worlds, and through it potentially even to the spiritual influence in those worlds or in those states within us. Of all the lunar cycles during the year, there are certain alignments which synchronize with the sun's greater cycle of the year. So there's the big cycle of the sun, where also you have the spring, autumn, winter, etc., representing a rising of the energies and then a sinking of the energies. And when that is synchronized with the moon's rising, it creates for a double rise. And from what I understood of the Vesak, this is the synchronization of the two. The spring energy is rising, and at the same time, the lunar cycle peaking, which makes for the time of an optimum opening to the higher realms in their most positive way.
Meanwhile, the other I is that in the Buddhist tradition, it is believed that on this full moon,
Yes.
the second high souls of Krishna, of Buddha, of Jesus, they come closer to the earth.
Yes.
They say this tradition
Yes.
that they kind of get closer to us. And
Yes.
many people around the world get together to meditate because the energies of love and the people.
Yes, yes. So in a different way, the same idea that it's as if there's a bridge which makes possible access both ways, from us to the higher, from the higher to the lower equally. Somehow things feel closer when these alignments take place. But of course, if we look at it from a purely spiritual perspective, you're only taking advantage of certain tides in the natural cycle. From a spiritual perspective, you could concentrate at any point and make the same contact with the same benefit. But here, without any special effort on your part, catching the wave of nature's cycles, you have that benefit, and so you can take advantage of it. So, traditionally in the spiritual systems, they gave importance to these cycles for the common man who may not have the ability to have that access. So they said, oh, here's a special day, observe this, do this to maximize and profit from that day. But in principle, you could be able to access that directly on any day. The same like the birthday. If you do nothing, that's a day when, because of the particular relation with the sun of your birth, you have a possibility of the soul receiving most easily, feeling closest to the divine help or influence with no special effort. But if you could sit down on any day and make that concentration, you could have that access equally at any time. So we can use these cycles, but we need not be bound by them. We'll continue next Friday. It's a fascinating chapter, and when Sri Aurobindo goes to first principles, you have there all the necessary knowledge to construct everything out of it. And so this text is so precious. And that's why I said there's nothing like this anywhere in any tradition, going to that level of first principles and building from there. Yes. 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 And the mapping that Sri Aurobindo makes in Savitri of all these planes, once you have studied this, it will be interesting to go back and read those passages where he describes the lower life worlds and the higher life worlds. And you'll see how he captures not only the quality of consciousness, but also the way the forces work, what are their primary drives, how they influence human affairs, their limitations as well as their strengths. And he maps out at each of these finer gradations, even of the vital worlds.